Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Robin Minter Smyers, President of the City Club's Board of Directors and a proud City Club member. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Ben Hecht, the President and CEO of Living Cities and author of Reclaiming the American Dream, Proven Solutions for Creating Economic Opportunity for All. He'll be in conversation with Rick Jackson, Senior Host and Producer for IdeaStream. For decades, the promise of the American dream often united Americans. It was the principle the country was founded on, that everyone, no matter their birth or station in life, had the opportunity for upward mobility. While our country has never fully lived up to this grand ideal, many would agree that today, for too many, the dream has started to crumble. Over the last several years, discussions of our country's economic troubles, rising inequality, and vast racial disparities have dominated the national discourse. So how do we address these challenges? Some believe that the path forward is through legislation. Mr. Hecht explores a different approach in his fourth book, Reclaiming the American Dream, Proven Solutions for Creating Economic Opportunity for All. In his experience, communities across the country are rekindling the promise of the American dream by improving educational opportunities, strengthening civic engagement, and providing a ladder to economic security. We'll hear more about that today. In addition to being an author, Mr. Hecht is the president and CEO of Living Cities, a collaborative of 18 of the world's leading foundations and financial institutions who work together to address poverty in America's cities. Prior to joining Living Cities, he co-founded One Economy Corporation, a nonprofit organization focused on connecting low-income people to the economic mainstream through online content and increased broadband access. Mr. Hecht has been selected as one of the top 100 city innovators worldwide in the area of urban policy and as a Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Center resident fellow. He holds a JD from Georgetown University. Mr. Hecht will be in conversation with IdeaStream senior host and producer, Rick Jackson. Mr. Jackson is an award-winning journalist with more than 35 years of experience as a television and radio anchor and reporter. He's been on air in all 50 states and in 40 foreign countries, and is currently the host of Ideas and News Depths for WVIZ PBS. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Ben Hecht and Rick Jackson.
Thank you all. Thank you, Robin, for the introduction. You know, I want to thank you for forsaking the East Coast and coming here on a nice rainy day in Cleveland. This is the way it always is, so thank you. What I was prepared to start talking about, had this been last Friday, I will say for right now, because I know Living Cities has made and would continue to make statements about two cities in particular, Louisville and my hometown of Pittsburgh. They remind us recently of what you've opined, that we have a history of hatred and racism. It runs through American history, and sadly it continues to echo. Start the conversation there with what you see, what options for improvement are available to us as a city to foster more than intolerance.
Yeah. So thank you, and thank you all for coming and for having me here. Thank you. So my staff refers to me as frustratingly optimistic.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, and I will say in the last year in particular, it's been hard to live up to that moniker because there are so many things that you thought were the foundations of American society that seem to be at risk or fracturing. And I think in the last week, so if there's a good side to all the evil that we see around us, it's that it has ripped off the veil and made us clearly, you have to choose sides. Are you on the side of the America you want it to be, and therefore are you going to take actions affirmatively to get there, or are you not? And not standing up, not acting, not doing all you can within your own agency to challenge that way of acting, you're making a statement. And so, Louisville, what Rick's referring to is two black people were killed in the Krogers in Louisville last week. And that was, so the bombs were sent to all kinds of Americans.
Places, right?
Yeah, and all kinds of places. And then that was Monday. And then Wednesday, these two black folks were killed shopping at the Kroger. And then Saturday were the killing of the 11 Jews. And I think what it made very clear is it's like, as we've seen throughout history, not just American history, but world history, that no one's safe. When you create a society like this, no one is safe. And in many ways, and so in Louisville, we work around the country with local governments who are actually trying to attack institutional and structural racism in their government. Which is part of the solution I talk about. One of the things I talk about in the book is like we actually have to be honest and open and say racism has been with us since 1400 when we first brought people here and sold them as slaves, and it is in the groundwater, and unless you fix the groundwater, you're never going to actually solve the problem. You're just putting Band-Aids or putting lipstick on a pig, and so. I think what the last week has shown is that we have to take affirmative actions. And one of the main stories of my whole book is I talk about proven solutions throughout. How do we get people more education? How do we make sure that they have more income, build wealth, get connected to opportunity, build a civil society that will enable this to happen? And when I was done, I went through it all and I said, do any of these things need laws or regulations to change to make happen in their own community? And the answer was no, none. And we'll talk about some of those solutions.
We will.
And it's like, what do you mean we don't need to change the laws? No, we actually need to change our behaviors. If you're a superintendent of school, if you're a head of a university, if you're a head of a philanthropy, if you're a citizen, you're a CEO, you literally have to lean into the power you already have and say, I'm not going to do my work with rose-colored glasses anymore. And what I'm going to do is actually attack these problems and get as close to the root as I can.
At this point in our civic narrative, though, our treatment of each other, our treatment of those living in proximity to us who aren't us, we can't rely on that leadership to do everything top down. We can't project on them to look forward and see what could happen in a synagogue. It's really inherent that we do that.
I totally agree. And that's what I mean by leaning into your own power and authority. And I'll just a couple of examples in the book. So let's just take a private sector CEO. I don't know if there's any in the room, but there are 24 million frontline workers in America. And you know what those are. Those are the folks you just heard who answer the phone and set up your appointment, right? Or you walk in the doctor's office and they welcome you and then you check out with them. 24 million of them in America. Those are largely people with a high school education. And most of the employers of those folks need employees with more education than that. And every one of these companies has tuition assistance programs already that nobody uses. Like 75% of tuition assistance programs at corporate companies are not used.
Huge numbers.
It's
75%.
ridiculous. But they also know that every dollar that's spent gets a $1.25 return to the company. So a few years ago, Southern New Hampshire University, based in Southern New Hampshire, started an online college called College for America, just for companies and their employees. And the idea was, you need competencies that these people don't have. You don't need them to sit in a chair and go through all these classes, you need them to be able to prove that they have competencies. And so they work with the companies to understand what those competencies are, and then the employees can online at their own pace for like $1,500 a semester take all the courses they need to prove they have the competencies. So the woman that I talk about here works for Aetna, and she got her associate's degree in 4 months. And when I asked her, why did you get your associate's degree in 4 months? She said, turns out I'm 43 years old, I know a lot. And then she got her bachelor's in 8 months. And so I go around the country and talk about the book, and I bring the people from the book to some of these things. And the woman who runs HR for one of these companies said she had to convince her CEO to simply expand their tuition assistance program to pay for competency-based degrees, not time in a seat degree. And once they did that, the folks who took it, 30% of them within months got a promotion and more money because the companies actually needed it to happen. So now there's hundreds of companies that are doing it, thousands of people, and most of them are graduating without any debt because they have the tuition assistance program. Right? So this is already out there. You simply, if you're a CEO, you simply make it available to your employees. You're not even adding money to your budget because you already have the tuition assistance that nobody's using.
I'm glad you took us to the book because I started outside the covers, and we're here to talk about the book and the situations like that you have found and are being developed around the country. In the book, you talk about the need for a new normal.
Yeah.
Tell us what a new normal is, but tell us what normal is.
Yes. So normal is what we have now, which is systems in America, education systems, job creation systems, entrepreneurship, that basically were built in the 1900s, largely for white people, and largely for white people with income and wealth. And right now we have a new majority, soon to be new majority of people who aren't white, people of color, who the systems have not allowed them to have the income and wealth, and they're not preparing them to have the income and wealth. So we're actually, it's a self-defeating process that we have. So let me tell you what I mean by that. So today in America, people of color basically are making 59 cents to every dollar in income that white people make. Wealth, when it comes to wealth, people of color have a dime to every dollar of wealth, right? So just entrepreneurship. Anybody here start a company? Yeah, how did you start? Where'd you get your money? Yeah. Friends and family, right? Friends and family is how Americans and most people start companies. Well, if you're making 59 cents, and all your friends are making 59 cents to the $1 of the white, you have a dime, your friends and family don't have. You know, and so Justin is here. Justin Bibb works with Gallup, and Gallup's actually done a ton of work to say what are the competencies that people need to be an entrepreneur. And they figured it out, and it turns out the people who have those competencies, it doesn't matter if you're white or black, doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, doesn't matter if you live on one side of town or another, you have the competencies or you don't. So the competencies are universal, the opportunity is not. And so right now, we actually aren't generating 90% of all new jobs, net new jobs come from companies less than 5 years old. And without capital getting to people of color, we aren't creating the jobs that we created over the last 40 years.
Because upward mobility has never been based on racial equality.
Right, and so the new normal is having people of color have control over capital to then make investments, whether it's debt or venture capital, into the people that they know and are comfortable with, just like white people make investments in people who are white who they're comfortable with. And so the new normal is to say we have a new majority of of people of color, and yet our old systems don't actually serve the new majority. And the last thing I'll say about it is the reason it matters, so I believe it's a moral imperative, but actually even if you don't believe that, it's an economic imperative. Why? Because we, like most Western democracies, are 70+% reliant on consumer spending to drive our economy. 74% of our GDP comes from consumer spending. And so right now, if you look at our demographics, in 2050, when we will be a new majority, and if the systems stay the same, that new majority will not have the income and wealth to drive an economy that is 74% reliant on consumer spending. It's just a simple math. And that's the new normal, has to actually make sure that we get the results that the current systems don't get.
You made a point that at one time we were closer together. This disparity was not as wide because of the war, post-war, we're talking two.
Yeah.
And then in the 1970s, as the boom ended, it all fell apart.
Right.
How do we get back to where we were? It seems strange to want to go backwards 50 years.
Well, what people don't realize, and it's part of our, like, we as Americans are always looking forward, but that often means we don't actually pay enough attention to what happened in the past, and how do we overcome things we did in the past. And so what's interesting about, so how many of you here know the narrative about a rising tide lifts all boats, right?
Half the room, yeah.
Yeah, so the reality is a rising tide lifted all boats in America for about 30 years, from 1945 to about 1975, because we were the only economic power in the world. But throughout American history, a rising tide didn't lift all boats. That's why we did public education in the early 20th century, because people weren't magically getting the education they needed for the current economy. Rising tide didn't create the greatest college boom ever. That was the GI Bill that created that. And so the reality is that because we were an economic power, we created this narrative that the markets will solve our inequality, but they never solved our inequality. And so then when 75 hit and the rest of the world came back, we still had that narrative that was dominant narrative. And what we really need to do is say, it's not about the markets alone, it's not about government alone, it's not about philanthropy alone. It's like, how do we come together and actually re-knit this society so we can get back to the kinds of the less disparities than we have now.
You touched on the idea of schools and education. Phrase we're hearing, new phrase, I guess, cradle to career.
Yeah.
We're seeing more and more people talking about that. Places attempt to get kids a great start in the hopes that it continues to be a great educated life. How can cities become more involved in bringing our children from here to there?
Yeah. So there's, so the other thing I want to say, I should have said at the beginning about the book, is that, so I have this great perch in that I get to travel around the country and see what's happening. And I basically spend my time looking at patterns. And the pattern that I saw, which led to the book, was that in place, over and over, local leaders, usually a coalition of local leaders, public, private, philanthropic, nonprofit, said, there's no one here who's going to solve our problems. We're going to have to solve them ourselves. And they came up with new normals on education, on job creation, on reknitting the social fabric. And because of technology and other networks, they started spreading all over. And that the idea is not that these are one-off things. These are things that have landed in multiple places, oftentimes hundreds of places. And education's such a great example. So there are actually cradle-to-career efforts that are happening that actually started in Cincinnati, just right down the road, that I talk about in Chapter 4. Right. And it's the Strive Together effort in Cincinnati, which for whatever reasons have never really taken hold here in Cleveland. And I would ask yourselves, why not? Because they've taken hold in 80 places. We actually helped the folks in Cincinnati figure out, is there a formula here that other places could use? And 80 other cities and regions around the country are following that formula. And they're making it work within their own framework. But what it requires are a handful of things that people don't like to do. One of them is you have to actually articulate what are the results you want to see. If third grade reading is one of your key, there's 7 key things along the continuum. If third grade reading is your thing, then you have to say, we will not tolerate third grade reading rates be less than 90%. By third grade, you should read it, 90% of the kids should read at grade level. What it requires is you to have results that you're going to then publicly hold yourself accountable every year about whether you're making progress. So number one, leaders, again, they don't need any more money. They have to actually agree they're going to hold themselves accountable. Doesn't happen. Number two, you have to publicly make it available. 3, it's going to require you to agree that you're as much a part of the problem as you are part of the solution. And so Nancy Zimpher, who was one of the people who led this work in Cincinnati, When she brought everybody together, she invited the superintendent of schools. And the superintendent said, I'm not going to that table of cross-sector leaders because everyone's going to complain that 50% of my kids don't graduate from high school. And Nancy said, if they're going to say that about you, they're going to say it about me because 50% of my kids at University of Cincinnati don't graduate either. We are all as much a part of the problem as we are a part of the solution. So it requires people to actually believe that they're not doing the work, the way they're doing their work is not working.
Let's change the topic because you spend a lot of time on the idea of home ownership. It is, I don't know, the single biggest driver, I guess, of the income gap because so many people inherit, so many people don't.
Yep.
Talk about how we can use home ownership to bring about more parity.
Yeah. So Cleveland's a hard one in many ways because you have market forces that are challenging. You have both a lot of property and a lot of land, but a lot of it distressed. And what we found is a couple things. So first of all, it's really important to understand in America today, and it has to change, but it's still true probably for our lifetimes, if you have wealth, it's from equity in a home, especially if you're a person of color. And so almost 90% of wealth of people of color comes from equity in their home. And so until we have other alternative ways of building wealth, we have to figure out how do we make that work. And so there's been a number of things that have happened over the last few years that have been that we've been able to figure out how do you get responsible home lending, not the predatory stuff before the Great Recession. Responsible ones that actually allow people to use alternative sources of credit, not just your credit score, but you've paid your utility bill for 3 years without default. We extended how much income to debt you can have within reason. All these responsible but more flexible underwriting. There's now mortgages that are sold through the traditional markets, not the predatory markets for that. So there are products. The challenge is that there is no trust because in many ways, people of color, there's 7 million people of color who are mortgage ready right now in America. And I'm sure, I don't know the number in Cleveland, but there's a lot. Which means they have the income, they have the credit worthiness and the like, but they're not applying. And so as we've talked to people, the reason they're not applying is because within 1 or 2 degrees of separation, they have a family member, a friend who actually was a victim of predatory lending, did lose their home and their equity through the foreclosure crisis. And so what has to happen is this mix of, at the community level, to be able to rebuild that trust, create avenues for people to be able to take advantage of these actually responsible products, but also build on the public sector side, build safety nets. So when there is the next crash, if there is, that people don't lose all their equity. If you remember in 2007, 2008, the only people saved were the financial institutions. There was very little money put into individuals, very intentional decisions. Well, what we're seeing around the country is local governments and states are actually creating these funds. So if that does happen again, people don't have their equity wiped out.
When it comes to Cleveland, we look back 70 years, 80 years, and we had the redlining situations here that still impact us in some instances today. We're not unique, certainly, but there aren't that many cities that have to deal with the situations we have to deal with before you get to the starting line.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that I really love about Cleveland. Evelyn Burnett, where are you? Evelyn Burnett is in the audience. So Evelyn and others at Cleveland Neighborhood Progress did an effort last year or a year and a half ago called a Year of Awareness, which was to actually raise the consciousness of race and racism in Cleveland. And they've had more than 2,400 leaders go through this training, which basically creates a common language for everybody to understand not only our history, which we're not taught, but also it creates and normalizes a conversation about that. That is the absolute first step that has to happen, because until we do that, until we can talk about race and redlining in the financial institutions, in the government, in the foundations, we're never going to solve it. And so it's a critical first step. But then once you do it, you actually have to take steps. So one of the things that we know is that just making homeownership opportunities available to people of color in those same neighborhoods that aren't appreciating doesn't really help them build equity.
Right.
And so it means that the realtors, the bankers have to affirmatively help people get into higher opportunity neighborhoods. You're taking on segregation at its face, you're taking on all of those things, but that's where the leadership comes in. We don't have to pass any more laws to protect people. We actually have to have each of us enforce the laws we already have and change the way we act. You know, and so if I'm living in a primarily white neighborhood, how do I react, or who do I try to help to be my neighbor? You know, it actually, the way that you desegregate communities is they actually get desegregated. and that means people can move there, right? And I mean, desegregation, it sounds so painful, but actually most people would agree that they like neighborhoods that are diverse, right? There are some people who want to live within their gate, that's fine. But most people, many people, want to live in a diverse neighborhood. And so we have to affirmatively take actions, many of them within our control. We're head of a bank, we're a realtor, you know, all of those things. But it's step by step. You know, we are talking about reversing hundreds of years, a system that was built for over hundreds of years that is sustained, you know, with these structural and institutional racism that we actually can't even see. And that's where the training comes in. So it allows you to at least see it and then start to take action.
You talk about a diversity explosion as a positive.
Yeah.
But I'm sure at Living Cities, you see areas that push back and say, no, for us, that's not a positive.
Right, right. And so I think they're wrong. So again, just for our economy's purposes, most Western democracies are not growing. And the only way you have a chance of sustaining your quality of life is if your population continues to grow. So just take Social Security, right? We're closer to Social Security than some of the people in the room, right? And it's based.
I hate to admit it, but yeah.
Yeah, but it's based on a ton of people coming behind us and paying into the system.
You guys.
Yeah, that's why we love the young people here. And so more of those means our systems will work. And we're one of the few Western democracies where that's true. And so and those people are people of color. And so it is a good thing. You know, if you're a racist, which is what we're talking about in much of the response we're seeing around the country right now, it's not a good thing based on fear and you know, ignorance. But if you actually care about your children and your grandchildren, you want an America that is as economically secure as the America we grew up in. And that means the future generation has to have more education, more income, more wealth, and actually believes in investing in our civic fabric.
Interesting how we keep getting back to the idea of education. And there's so much that goes on that we could do a better job with. You talked early on education.
Yeah.
What about college education? The idea of not just those who are working now that you want to send back and get out of their chairs, but we have so many kids who could achieve and don't achieve.
Yeah, and so that is, so I spent a whole chapter on that. So again, the book is not about like the folks who are like the really hardest to serve. And it's not a policy book. It's what are solutions that have actually worked for people who are really what I call low-hanging fruit. And so, and those are, every year, there's 2.5 million people enroll in college, every year. And every year, 600,000 of them drop out. 600,000, most of them people of color. And what's horrible about the last decade is they drop out with debt. So that's the worst of all worlds. They don't have the education they need for our economy, and they drop out with debt. So what's happened is a number of universities, and I talk about Georgia State in the chapter, they basically said, are we about getting kids to enroll, or are we about getting kids to graduate? Right? And this again, when I talk to these leaders, essentially they have one common thread, which is, I found it personally intolerable to be at an institution that lost its way, and I'm going to change it. I mean, it's literally that simple. Now, that's called leadership.
Are other
right?
schools looking at that and saying, hey, us too?
Exactly. And so what they did is they get all this data all the time, you know, and like big data. They know all about their students, and so they said, what are the patterns that we see? And what they saw was that there were patterns that certain kids coming with certain backgrounds, whether it's educational backgrounds, meaning science or liberal arts or whatever, from certain communities or states or whatever, were having the same experiences. And so they said, okay. So they have 100-some different interventions based on the algorithm that those kids fit in. And some of them are incredibly cheap. And so, for example, there's a thing called summer melt, which is kids get into college, and by the time and they graduate high school in May or June, and they get into college, and by September, they actually don't enroll. And that's what they call the summer melt. The enrollment numbers melt over the summer. So it turns out why? Because they don't know people who've gone to college before. They're afraid of it. And so what it turns out is if you text these kids for a penny, 0.10 of a penny, and you say, you know, you have to do something by July 1, and then you have to do something by July 30. We look forward to seeing you on August 5th. In some places, literally the melt rate went to almost nothing.
So the schools need to be almost a parent or a grandparent because the parent or grandparent never did this themselves.
Whatever the reason is, the current way that our nation works fails the majority of people. And so what they figured out is, what are the ways that we can intervene? And so Georgia State now has helped others. The Gates Foundation actually has a network of these universities who are serving large numbers of people of color, so they can actually share these best practices and actually bring them to the fore right away.
We've talked about maybe 10, 15% of the book. There's so much more. It's a good read. I would advise you to go ahead and do that. Robin will give us a few words first.
Today we're listening to a forum with Ben Hecht, President and CEO of Living Cities and author of Reclaiming the American Dream, Proven Solutions for Creating Economic Opportunity for All. He's in conversation with Rick Jackson, senior host and producer for IdeaStream. We're about to begin the audience Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, or those of you joining us via our radio broadcast or live stream. If you'd like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club, and our staff will try to work it into the program. Holding the microphones today are Marketing and Outreach Coordinator Julia Wong and Content Coordinator Bliss Davis. May we have the first question, please?
Yes, sir. I'd like for you to please talk about how this current rhetoric is hurting us in terms of immigration, because it's been my experience, I don't know a harder working group of people, whether they be documented or undocumented.
Absolutely. And so I was saying earlier, I wrote a blog with one of my other people on the management team at Living Cities, Nadia Owusu, this week after last week in Pittsburgh and Louisville and the bombing. And we talked about the work in Louisville, and one of the people in Louisville who runs the chief equity officer for Mayor Fisher in Louisville. Her father was one of the two that were killed, and she's an important partner of ours in Louisville. And then there were the 11 people killed, and part of the reason the shooter in Pittsburgh says was because that congregation supported HIAS, which is one of the leading refugee support organizations. Well, my grandparents came here because of HIAS. I mean, they literally, in the late 1800s or early 1900s, if it wasn't for HIAS, my grandparents wouldn't have come here. And so the reality is that while the immigrants have long been an essential part of America, when my grandparents came here, they were not considered white, and over time we've become white. But the reality is that you can see if you can go out west and talk to to agriculture. We need the workers, and it's true pretty much everywhere in the country. So I totally agree with you. It's completely ahistorical to say that immigrants do anything but help to drive our economy. It's completely ahistorical.
Question here?
Let's talk about possible solutions. You emphasized education. You used the example of setting the bar that every student was to read at a third grade level by the third grade, of all strange things.
Yeah.
One of the great problems, it seems, is that children enter school with no background, no ability to comprehend what they're doing. Many don't even know their alphabet. Mm-hmm. Can you share with us some practical solutions you've seen to ready students prior to the first grade?
Yep.
And should pre-K be mandatory?
Yeah, well, so that's one of the things I was going to talk about. So the surprise of me, in my bias, I guess, the state of Oklahoma actually publicly funds up to 4 years old, back to 4 years old, I guess. And the bottom line is this. So yes, there are ways, but when it comes to the new normals, I think education is such a good example, and I think about my grandparents in that regard. So high school was not universal in America until 1918, right? Every state finally had high school, free public education through high school by 1918. And so what, 200 years ago, right? Or whatever the math is, 100 years ago, right? Yeah, whatever. And
he's a writer. Come on.
Yeah. I'm actually an accountant, which is bad. But the bottom line was we had a public education system at the time that produced education that was good enough for the economy at the time, right? So my grandparents, all four of them, they were all immigrants. All four of them were able to live a life. They weren't rich, but they lived a life. They supported their kids and all of that because they had a good enough education for the economy at the time. And I don't believe there's a single person in this room who believes that the current education system is good enough for the economy at the time. And so if that means, so I think it means two things. I think it means that we have to redefine public education to go back to what the science tells us where it has to go, and why 6 years old in kindergarten. Nobody would argue that makes any sense anymore. And it has to go forward. So chapter 1 in the book is actually about these early college high schools where 280 high schools in 23 states are making it so kids can graduate high school with a free associate's degree. Why is not every high school like that? There's no reason other than the university president and the superintendent of schools can't agree. That's the only reason. I spoke to a half a dozen superintendents of public schools around the country about this issue, and the only thing that stood in their way was agreement that they were going to worry about the education of the kid, not who's sitting in the seats and for how long.
And right now we make a big deal out of it when a kid comes out with 5 or 6 or 10 credits.
Yeah, and and 100,000 kids have already benefited from this. 23 states, 280 high schools, but there are 25,000 high schools in America. So if we just need to redefine a new normal, and it's I like to say it's not that it's good or bad. It's just like let's just modernize for our times and for who our citizens are.
The answers are there. We're just not reading them.
Yeah.
Next question. Oh.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for a very informative discussion today. One of the things you touched on during your remarks was student loan debt.
Yeah.
And right now there's $1.5 trillion in outstanding student loan debt. And one of the things that I have started to see is states like Maine and even locally cities in Newark Heights have responded legislatively to try and tie in economic development and student loan debt.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could talk about the impact that has, but also if nothing needs to change maybe legislatively, how can behaviorally we address that issue?
Great question, and a really tough one. And some of the things I didn't put in the book were because they actually didn't have proven solutions. And I went down a lot of rabbit holes. And that one, it actually doesn't have a lot of proven solutions. So there's some interesting, promising practices like Maine. Where in Maine, if you don't know it, the legislature actually passed appropriations. So if people will stay or come back to Maine and run their businesses, they will actually pay the student loans. And because it is a huge burden on people. I mean, one of the things about, America in many ways was built on your ability to be mobile. You know, whether it was a great migration from the south to the north or from the east to the Sun Belt. And because of mortgage debt and student debt, the mobility is radically down. And so the challenges are significant. I fundamentally believe that what we have to do is make it that you get 2 years of college for free from high school. I just think it's the most logical thing. It's not free community college. It's not free Ohio State or whatever it is. I just think we should say you have to have 2 years of college. I mean, you have to the equivalent of 2 years of post-high school education to survive. You know, but until then, I think we need creative examples to tie the two.
In Cleveland, we talk a lot about the skills gap, these jobs that we don't have those people for. Is that universal? Do we see that across America?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there are places that, like Houston, has way more high-paying jobs than people to fill them. And some places, it's just this gap. You know, the 24 million frontline workers is that. Right. And those companies are everywhere.
They're all potential.
Right. It's all potential.
So how are people supposed to find out about the tuitions programs if companies don't advertise it?
If the companies don't
advertise
it, yeah. So that's part of what we have to get them to be able to do. You know, and so what's interesting is the woman who runs Partners Healthcare in Massachusetts, which is I think the second largest company in Massachusetts. She runs the HR department, which is this fits in. She's the one who had to convince her CEO that they should make this available. And basically, she took on, again, as her personal agency in that position to make this part of her job and to use her political capital with the CEO to get him to do it. But once they did, they started out as a small pilot program because the CEO said nobody will use it. They started out as a small pilot program where no more than 500 people could try it. Within 2 years, all 500 people had, 30% of them had been promoted, and now it's open to 74,000 employees, but they market it just like they market the 401k retirement program, their employee assistance program if you have personal challenges. So you actually just have to, the people in those positions have to make it real.
For the people on the radio, that question came from a table full of what appears to be all students. Do you all want to go to college? Yes. Every single one of them said yes. Do you all have difficulty in finding ways to make the payments happen? Yeah. That's where we all need to be helping.
That's right. And it's our job to make that easier and not just to admire the problem and say, isn't it too bad that, a third of that table will go to college and then drop out in a year with debt. I mean, I don't mean all of you, I just mean statistically.
Not you specifically.
You will not, but statistically, that's a reality.
Okay. Next question.
I hope my question doesn't sound adversarial. I wanted to ask you about what you said about home ownership. It seems to me that buying a house is not the biggest investment you will ever make. It's the biggest purchase you will ever make. And when you consider the property taxes and the maintenance costs, et cetera, it is really a very poor investment. Yet, the federal government encourages home ownership, and I really thought since the housing collapse that perhaps policies would change to, maybe give preference to other kinds of investments.
Right.
So could you comment on that?
Absolutely.
The perils of home ownership, because equity is nothing but dead cash.
Yeah, so I do not at all believe, I like dead cash, by the way, but I do not at all believe that is the answer for everyone. I actually believe it's the answer for those 7 million people who are mortgage ready, right? That means they actually should be homeowners, and they're not extending too far. It's like they should be able to do it. But that said, what is different about homeownership? So first of all, those other options aren't available. They're just not out there right now. And what's different about homeownership and with mortgages is the leverage. And that's what people don't appreciate. So any other asset, so you go buy $2,000 worth of stocks and they go up 10%, you've made $200, right? Everybody with me? Mm-hmm. But if you can go buy a $100,000 home, or $10,000 home with $2,000. Okay, the same $2,000, you can buy a $10,000 home, and when that $10,000 home goes up 10%, then you've made $1,000, right? So now you have $3,000 versus $2,200, right? And that leverage. And then the other part is, and you can't underestimate this, especially in more struggling communities like Cleveland, the stability that it brings. The stability of being able to know that your kids can stay in the same school. One of the biggest challenges in public schools right now in America is that the kids can't stay in the same school more than one consecutive year.
And there are some cases we have in Cleveland where kids are in 5, 6, and 7
In the
schools
same year.
in a year.
Yeah, and so what that means to their ability to have friendships, networks, just stability overall, and that can come from the home too. But I agree with you, it's not the panacea. But it is, I hear people saying, and I've not met a person of color who said this, but white people, and especially white economists, who say, I don't think I believe in home ownership anymore. So I say to them, have you sold your home? No, why would I sell my home? It's like, I'm done. I've got all I need right now. I don't believe it's good. I wouldn't do it, And so the idea that we need new ways to build wealth, absolutely. The idea that we're done with homeownership is insane. And so what we have to do is figure out, okay, but in the reality of how it works, and the reality of what people saw in 2007, 2008, we have to build the supports to make it so it actually works for everyone.
Bliss?
Good afternoon, Mr. Hecht. I was hoping that you could say a little bit about the role of prisons and how it is that they impact particularly people of color, both in urban and in rural areas, and the impact and sort of the marginalization of these populations because of the prisons.
Absolutely. So my wife is in criminal justice, and it turns out we didn't start out thinking that economic opportunity and mobility and criminal justice were going to be so intrinsically connected, and of course they are. So I think a couple of things. One is that I think the nation overall is on the right path, which is to dramatically cut back on incarceration, and to look for any alternatives but that. And then I think there's some other things. I mean, there's huge obstacles to like once you have millions of people who've been through that system, and then you have these institutional and structural racism in all of the systems that they then have to go back into. What are you going to do with that? And so you have to attack it piece by piece. But one piece that I really think is powerful is on voting, right? The connection of having been convicted of a felony and losing your right to vote goes back to, it's Jim Crow. It was just a way after slavery, after the slavery was abolished, to keep people from being able to vote, and mostly people of color, mostly African Americans. And so the trend that's happening around the country of governors figuring out whether they have to pardon people one by one. Terry McAuliffe in Virginia actually individually pardoned, I think it was close to 1 million former incarcerated folks, because that's what the law required, to get people their voting rights back. But the bottom line is, I think that we're on a path. I just think we have so much damage to overcome that there's no simple solutions. But I do think, to get back to the purpose of the City Club, it is about the democracy. And we ultimately have to, and I hope we see some positive signs on November 6th, that we have to take back the democracy. We have to make choices that say we're going to build the democracy and the society that we've kind of lost our way on.
Hi, so we have a question from Twitter. From your seat at the head of a philanthropic collaborative, what are your thoughts on the recent book, Winners Take All, The Elite Charade of Changing the World's argument that it's insufficient to do more good, but that philanthropy, private and social sector must do less harm?
Yeah, totally agree. And I know he was here last Friday, and I've seen him speak as well, and I've read the book. And that book actually was very painful because I saw myself in pretty much every chapter. But that's why people like that writing that kind of work is important. So I think a lot of it is true. And by that, what I mean is that in many ways, And I hope to think that what we do is trying to address some of those things, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I do think that there is a way to do, so who gets to decide what societal problems get fixed is a big issue. And if the people, if wealthy people, whether it's institutional or just high net worth people, are the ones who say, well, I'll give my money to only the issues that I think are important to serve, I don't believe that is good for our democracy. Currently, that's how it works, not for a lot of it. And not only do I get to decide what issues to work on, but I get to decide who works on those issues. That's huge. The other part that I think is really, that the point he makes that I think is really powerful is that oftentimes these solutions or these issues are actually not going to the root of the problem we're talking about. If we believe that the root of so many of these disparities is racism, you're not going to find many of these folks putting their money to actually getting to the root cause of racism. You may see them funding mentoring programs. That's not getting to the root cause.
Unless the people making the donations are brown themselves, brown people don't get help.
Oftentimes. Or they get help on programs, but not getting to the systemic problems. And so one of the key things that we actually do that I'm actually really proud of is when I took over 11 years ago, we said we are going to work with local governments, which is the only form of government that actually solves problems. And we are going to have help those local governments get better results for the money that they spend. And we're going to ride a trend of both electeds and people who work there who actually want to model a society, a different society with different results. And so we do, the folks who support us, who are many of the folks that he's critical of, at least with us, we are actually trying to do solutions that are supporting democracy, because that's his other thing. He's like, the other thing is you can support social change or social justice that doesn't include democracy and getting democracy to solve the problem, and which means, instead of, I think one of the examples he uses is you want to solve a problem, you're a young person, you're at an Ivy League school, you want to start a social enterprise, and then with the money you make, the profits you make from your cupcake sales, you're going to give it away, versus actually engaging people in the change. And the idea that the only way you actually address inequality is to fundamentally have the democracy demand it. The democracy has to demand that the inequality does not exist.
Probably have time for one more question.
So thank you for coming. You work for an organization called Living Cities. We in this country right now are seeing a bit of a divide between the urban and rural populations. Can you speak to that relationship and how you can see both those communities being successful?
Yeah, so we are living cities, and we are about cities. But what's interesting about the proven solutions that I talk about are not just in big cities, in fact. And in fact, in many smaller cities, you have less of these legacy institutions that keep change from happening. You just also have a lot less capacity, and you have a lot less money. And so, I think the reality is we can't write off any of our citizens, and it makes the folks who are in those rural areas, it makes their individual choices of leadership even more important. But I will say the demographics tell us that the vast majority of Americans are in metropolitan areas, right? It's almost some 75, 80%. And so, we really do have to figure out how do we solve these problems for 80% of the population and the rest. I don't think it's an either or, but they're not equivalents as the future of our country goes, as the economy goes.
Book is called Reclaiming the American Dream. Reclaiming means it's not dead yet, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. Robin, this has been Hecht.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Today at the City Club, we are listening to a forum with Ben Hecht, President and CEO of Living Cities, and author of Reclaiming the American Dream, Proven Solutions for Creating Economic Opportunity for All. He's been in conversation with Rick Jackson, senior host and producer for IdeaStream. Today's forum is the annual George S. Dively Memorial Forum on Cleveland's Tomorrow, made possible by a generous endowment gift from the George Dively Foundation. We appreciate their support of City Club programming. Today's forum is also part of our Authors in Conversation series, supported in part by the residents of Cuyahoga County through a public grant from Cuyahoga Arts and Culture. We are grateful to all of the residents of Cuyahoga County for their support of City Club programming through that public grant. Community partners for today's forum include the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland and Third Space Action Lab and Cafe. Our hospitality partner is the Metropolitan at the 9 Hotel. We thank all of you for your partnership. Lastly, we welcome guests at tables hosted by the Council of International Programs USA and the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, and students from Maple Heights High School and North Olmsted High School. Support for student participation in City Club forums comes from KeyBank and the William M. Weiss Foundation, with additional support from donors you'll find listed in today's program. We thank all of you for being here today. The sale of Mr. Hecht's book, Reclaiming the American Dream, Proven Solutions for Creating Economic Opportunity for All, is provided by A Cultural Exchange. And that brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you, Mr. Hecht and Mr. Jackson. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org. Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland Incorporated.